Florida State gets left out of the college football playoffs by the committee after going undefeated and winning their conference. Now, if you're a Florida State fan, I completely understand the frustration. There's not much more you can do than go out and beat every single opponent that's put out in front of you and then go and win your conference. But with that being said, it's been repeated multiple times by the college football masses. It's not the most deserving four teams that are supposed to get in. It is the best four teams. Now, people will still make the argument that Florida State, by going undefeated and winning their conference, is one of the best four teams. But whenever you start to break down who they played in their conference and their best wins, you're struggling to find a case that Florida State is one of the best four teams. Now, the first thing I want to talk about, Drew, is a lot of Florida State fans are showing this graphic, and we'll put it up real quick, of, Alabama's tough losses or tough wins and tough loss to Texas. And you cannot do that math. It doesn't work with college football, Drew. All you can do is win or lose that game. Specifically that South Florida game. Did anybody even watch that game? They didn't play Jalen Milroe to show the college football fans that Jalen Milroe was the best quarterback they had. I've been saying that all season. Nick Saban did not put Jalen Milroe in that South Florida game to prove a point. He could have won that game with his staff putting on pads and helmets and going out there and playing. Also, Florida State, Drew, they have some tough wins too that they probably shouldn't have gotten out of. That Clemson game in OT, that Boston College game was really close. That Miami game, they should have lost. They won off of a safety that wasn't called. Florida State's most impressive win was against LSU in week 1. Now, you can't go knock Florida State. They went and scheduled 2 SEC games. That's another thing people are saying. The quality of the SEC teams they played was not good. LSU and Florida are both bad SEC teams this year. And people are saying Florida State's most impressive win is LSU. Alabama dog-waxed LSU just like Florida State did in the middle of the season. So it doesn't make sense to me. You have to credit Alabama for beating Georgia, who has not lost in over 750 days and also went undefeated in the SEC just like Alabama did. Georgia was the best team in the country, Drew. Both Alabama and Georgia were undefeated in the SEC. Alabama's only loss is to the Big 12 champion, who is also in the playoffs in the second week of the season. And we've seen how this Alabama team has transformed from week 1 to now. So in that rematch against Texas, I like Alabama, but nonetheless, you have to reward the undefeated SEC champion in conference play with the playoff spot. When you look at the ACC conference versus the SEC conference, we'll put that up if we can too. Where's the tough team in the ACC? The teams in the ACC that are normally good are bad. North Carolina had 4 losses in the conference. Clemson had 4 losses in the conference. Louisville was the best team in the conference and got mollywopped by a 7-5 Kentucky team. And you can point at the 6-4 record that the ACC has against the SEC, but look at the teams the ACC played. They did not play any of the good SEC teams. And when you do look at the good SEC teams like Alabama and Georgia, if they went into the ACC, they would win out and mollywop every single team just like Florida State did. And Florida State did not even go and win these games by impressive margins. They were close games. And my last point, I'm just going to say this. Losing Jordan Travis was the reason Florida State did not make it in the college playoffs. If you have 3 points at halftime against one of the top 4 teams in the country, you're going to get your fucking ass beat. 16-6 against Louisville was the performance that the committee needed Florida State to have to justify not putting them in. And Drew, in my opinion, it's the right decision. Florida State just does not have the quality of wins that Alabama, Texas, Washington, and Michigan have.
Well, this is the biggest problem when people look at a 4-team playoff, because you're going to be in situations where you find that number 4 spot and the controversy for that number 4 spot really come into play. There was no decision the committee was going to make where they were going to get 100% support. And again, to go back to what you were saying, Gaten, if I'm a Florida State fan, I'm irate. I did everything the committee said I had to do. I beat everyone I played. I went 13-0. But in the same breath, if I'm an Alabama fan, there's no reason where I feel like I should be left out either. You just beat the number 1 Georgia Bulldogs, who haven't lost a game in over 700 however many days, back-to-back national champions. And then just going off, Aiden, the playoff committee. This comes from the playoff committee. This isn't coming from us. This is not our words. The playoff committee says they are trying to get the 4 best football teams in. And we've been saying that for the past couple weeks when we're talking about the playoff picture, who's going to get in, whatnot. So when you look at that Florida State game against Louisville, just going back to recently, it was a hard watch, Aiden. I couldn't watch hardly. Florida State could barely get first downs. I know they don't have their starting quarterback in Jordan Travis. I know they didn't even have their second-string quarterback in. But I saw Florida State's second-string quarterback play against Florida, and it was relatively the same thing. And the Florida State offense was struggling against very, very inferior teams. Louisville, like we said, lost to Kentucky. The Kentucky 7-5, one of the 9th or 10th best teams in the SEC. This is the second-best team the ACC has to offer. The ACC is weak this year. So when you're looking at the playoff semifinals, the biggest thing that people talk about is they're sick of seeing these semifinal blowouts. We want competitive games throughout the entire playoffs. If you have a matchup between a number 1 seed and a number 4 seed, there shouldn't be a situation where that's a 30-point blowout. And you were going to look at something like that when Michigan played Florida State. I'm sorry. Michigan would have did whatever they wanted to Florida State and then some, and there's not a single soul that can convince me otherwise. Florida State was not going to magically find something in their second or third string quarterback where their offense was going to have some crazy explosion and put up 30 or 40 points on Michigan. It wasn't going to happen. Michigan's defense is too good. If y'all have, I'm going to put this clip up too. When Michigan found out they were playing Alabama, when they announced Alabama was getting in the playoffs, the reaction of the Michigan players said it all. They did not want to see Alabama. They wanted to see Florida State, and they wanted to see Florida State for a reason. They knew Florida State was the easier opponent. That in itself, this clip that I'm about to show in itself, proves the committee made the right decision.
Number 5, play broken. Who's number 4?
And again, I get it. You can't attack me for what I'm about to say because I get at Florida State. If my Georgia Bulldogs went 13-0 and we lost our starting quarterback and the playoff committee kept us out after that, I wouldn't even be able to record this video because I wouldn't have a computer to record with. I would be irate. But nonetheless, you have to look at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is, and you have to accept, you were not going to beat Michigan in the first round. You were not going to be competitive with them. Alabama and Nick Saban, regardless of what they did in the regular season, and you could point at this game and this game and this game for Alabama that they should have lost. You can do that for every single team in college football. I can go point out a couple games that Georgia should have lost. I can go point out a game or two that Michigan probably could have lost. I could have pointed out a game Washington could have lost. Texas. Every team in college football has a game or two, or a top team, I should say, that they could have lost to an inferior opponent, because that's what happens in college football. You're not going to blow everyone out by 20 and 30 points, and people that don't watch football seem to not understand how hard it is to win in the Power 5. Nonetheless, Alabama won those games. And so they're 12-1, beat the number 1 Georgia Bulldogs, the back-to-back national champions. They won the SEC, and they're gonna put up a better fight to Michigan than Florida State is. And there is not a single soul that can tell me otherwise.
Yeah, Drew, your point about there only being 4 spots in 5 Power 5 conferences. This is the first year we've seen, the Big 12 and the Pac-12 champion have a good enough resume and to get in, So this is the first year where all conference champions really could have a spot in the playoffs, but, there's 5 power conferences and only 4 spots. So the least impressive conference is not going to be represented in the playoffs. When you look at the ACC compared to the SEC, where, as I just said, Alabama undefeated in conference play in the toughest conference in college football, you would rather have the ACC represented in the playoffs than the SEC? That would be complete asinine. You just said it. Every team should have games that they could have lost or that were close games, But the fact that Alabama went undefeated in the toughest conference to do it in should be enough right there. And also, if Florida State were to play Alabama or Georgia, which we now are getting, right, what would the point spread be? I mean, this isn't that's it right there for me.
Hold on, I'm going to stop you just for 1 second, Aiden. The point spread came out this morning. Georgia is favored by 13.5 right now to Florida State.
And Drew, that's what I was saying when that game got announced. I said that Georgia would open up as double-digit favorites, at least 7-point favorites. And like you just said, it's 13 points. That's almost 2 touchdowns. Who in the hell thinks that if Georgia, who just lost to Alabama, who got in, who the fuck thinks Florida State would have a chance against any of the top 4 teams? I don't even think they would have a prayer against Washington, who I think should be out in place for Georgia. And that's what I want to talk about next, Drew. We have said this for the whole season. It's the best 4 teams. And you and me pretty much knew that they were going to make the wrong decision, and the decision that the committee made, finally leaving Florida State out and having Alabama in, that's what I thought the committee would do, because that's the safest option. But if we're going off the criteria of the best teams, Washington did not have the most impressive performance in the Pac-12 down the stretch. And you can look at the Pac-12, which many people have this year, and say the Pac-12 has gotten a lot better. The Pac-12 is really competitive this year, and it has gotten a lot better. But with that being said, it was down here, and then it moved to like up here, and this is the SEC. It's still below the SEC. You cannot justify to me the team that was ranked number 1, the back-to-back national champions on a 29-game win streak, who lose 1 game by 3 points to Nick Saban, who has never lost an SEC championship to Kirby Smart, and they dropped 5 spots? That makes no sense. Who would be favored against Georgia and Washington? Georgia. So how can you justify putting Washington in over Georgia? It's the same reason Florida State would have gotten in if the committee decided to put them in. They're going in off of resume instead of the fact that they are one of the best 4 teams in college football. And Drew, I think Texas is going to go out and show that against Washington. Like, Washington is a solid team. They have pieces at every single position. But when you look at this Texas team, they are an SEC-built team in the front 7 on defense and the O-line on offense. And we say this all the time, and it rings true every single year in the playoffs. You win and you lose in the trenches, offensive line and defensive line, and the depth that you have there. Texas's 2nd and 3rd string D-line is just as big, strong, and fast as Washington's starters. And in the playoffs, we see every single year. Look at TCU. Look at Cincinnati. Like, look at Central Florida when they didn't get in and they were upset and had to go play LSU. The depth and size and athleticism on the offensive and defensive line is the difference maker in these big games. And I think that that's going to be the case whenever you have Washington in, who is not as impressive performance-wise as Georgia. I think that it will show with Washington not being able to handle the front 7 and the D-line of Texas.
Yeah, I think Washington's only hopes in that game against Texas. Texas does have a young secondary. We all know what Washington's passing offense is. But in the same breath, this is a Texas team that has caught a lot of fire in the past couple of games they played. Their offense has looked absolutely amazing. And you can be one of those people that goes off and says, well, they haven't played anyone. Oklahoma State and Texas Tech, yada, 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 aren't very good. I've already seen that argument already. I've said this so many times, and I'm going to say it one last time. If you can't watch a football game when a better team is playing against a less talented team, and you can't tell that better team's good, then you just don't know what you're talking about. It doesn't matter who Texas is playing. For them to come out in the Big 12 title game and put up however many yards they put up, 42 points, Quinn Ewers threw for 800 yards in the first half, this is a good Texas team that's hitting their stride at the perfect time. If they can carry any resemblance against this Washington defense, Texas is going to do something very similar to what you saw against Texas Tech and Oklahoma State. Again, this isn't me knocking Washington. Washington had an incredible year, 13-0, beat Oregon twice. This is a credible year for Washington. But sometimes when you look at these conferences and you look at the differences between there's levels to this game. There's levels between the SEC and the Pac-12. There's levels to the Big Ten and the ACC. There are good teams in every conference. The reality is some conferences are just better than others. And with Texas, they're just better than Washington. I'm just going to go ahead and flat out and say it. They're just more talented. They have a better offensive line. They have a better defensive line. The front 7, 8, I mean, you mentioned everything that I wanted to mention. This you covered it perfectly. Texas's front is levels ahead of anything Washington is. And you're going to see that in this game. One last thing I really want to touch on before I kind of wrap my stuff up is the moronic statement that people are trying to make, saying that the SEC and the playoff committee is biased towards the SEC. There is one athletic director in the SEC that is a part of the committee, and that's the athletic director of Kentucky. The other athletic directors you might ask that are in it, Michigan, Nevada, Navy, NC State, I think. Where is this whole argument that the committee is biased towards the SEC? There is one, the athletic director from the SEC in the committee. And people are trying to run around and say that Alabama got in due to SEC bias. And this has been a thing that's been common throughout the past couple years of people trying to say that the SEC is just automatically getting in because the committee just thinks that the SEC should automatically be represented. As I said, the SEC is just better than these other conferences. I don't know how much more I can put it than that. If you can't accept that, then you just don't understand college football. I don't care how much you hate the SEC. I know a lot of people hate the SEC. But you cannot leave the SEC out in this situation. And I think Texas, a team, like you said, built for the SEC pretty much now, is going to leave a good example that teams built for SEC play are going to be superior to anyone else they play. And we've seen this time and time again in the past few playoffs. Look at Georgia when they played Michigan a couple years ago. Georgia beat Ohio State last year. The SEC usually represents well in the playoffs, Aiden, and I think it's just going to happen again.
Yeah, it's because they're one of the best teams in the conference. It's like, I could go play a bunch of shit cans and go undefeated, and then you can be in a conference with the best teams in the country and have one loss. Who's the better team? If I'm going and playing shit, and we saw that with Oregon, Drew. Dan Lanning was trying to get Bo Nix the Heisman. He was keeping him in, running the score up against Arizona, and they're putting up 6 touchdowns and a half. And then what? They have to go play Washington, an actual good team in the Pac-12, and they lose twice. That just goes to show you right there the difference in levels between the Pac-12 and the SEC. Tennessee could go into the Pac-12 and probably have one loss and win the Pac-12. The last thing I'm going to say, the national championship game was played on Saturday, okay? Alabama and Texas are going to be in the national championship, and Alabama's going to edge it out over Texas in the rematch. If you watch that SEC championship game, you saw a Georgia team that was beat up, that was limping offensively, and they lost their tackle Mims, went out in the middle of the game. That Georgia team was hurt, and Alabama skated through and won by 3, man. If that Georgia team was healthy, it would have been ugly, right? We saw, for example, the 49ers in the NFL. They went on a 3-game losing streak, Drew, right? In those 3 games, guess the player they did not have. No, it wasn't their running back, Christian McCaffrey. No, it wasn't their quarterback, Brock Purdy. No, it wasn't their tight end, George Kittle. It was their left tackle, Trent Williams. You live and you die by your offensive line. Georgia's star tackle going out in that game destroyed Georgia's game plan. Now, of course, Nick Saban, you're seeing it's coming out now, the adjustments that he made, going from an odd front to an even front, bringing those safeties down, disguising the defensive looks a lot better. But that's really getting into the X's and O's. At a surface level, Georgia was fucking hurt, and they still almost beat one of the best teams in the nation. If that doesn't justify them as a top 4 team, I don't know what will. But with all that being said, that was the national championship game right there, the SEC title. And Alabama won, and I think Alabama's going to go through and win it all. I cannot wait for Florida State to play Georgia and get absolutely mollywopped. So all this talk about Florida State should be in is going to be left out. Just like Central Florida a couple of years ago when they went undefeated 2 years in a row, go and play LSU and get beat by fucking 30. It's going to be the exact same thing. This Florida State just does not have the firepower. In the ACC championship game, Keon Coleman did not have a good game. He was dropping balls. That has nothing to do with the quarterback. It doesn't matter who was throwing to him. He would have dropped those balls anyways. Brunson couldn't get it going on the ground. But anyways, I'm getting carried away, guys. Alabama deserves to be in over a Florida State team. Although they went undefeated, did not have the quality of wins or the impressive enough resume to get in a 4 spots when you have 5 champions vying for those 4 spots. the least impressive champion is not going to get in, and that was Florida State.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. As always, if you enjoyed the video, leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And the comment section is always open. I know there's a lot of opinions going around right now about the College Football Playoff Committee, whether they put the right teams in or not. I'm sure all y'all have your own opinion, so be sure to leave those down below in the comment section, and we'll take a look at it, reply. All that good stuff. If you enjoyed the video, again, leave a thumbs up. That's going to do it. We'll see you in the next one.